Hello and welcome to my failed and hopefully successful painting of this model. As I find painting skin tones very difficult and form one of my largest skill gaps, I figured printing a large figure would force me into painting those tricky areas. To start the process of colour selection for this figure, I like to block out the individual parts to get a rough idea if my colour scheme will work. Using colour wheels can be handy, but sometimes it's easier to see it on the actual product. Although I base coated this figure in acrylics, I'll mainly be using oils to complete the figure. The Vallejo medium flesh tone and the yellow ochre oil paint seemed like a good match to start the process of creating the skin tones. To create the two highlights from the base colour, I simply added white, and for the darker tones that will be used in the shadowy areas, I added increasing amounts of red, blue and Payne's grey. Unfortunately, my choice of blue and Payne's grey will create the problem that we'll see later. I did look up multiple recipes for skin tones for classical face painting on canvases, but I forgot one major part of oil paints, which we get to later. One thing to consider if you are going to paint this model is where the shadows will actually be. As she is bent over, the light will be naturally highlighting her rear. With this in mind, my confidence in colour selection drove me forward to start highlighting the model, blissfully unaware of the horror show that's about to happen. Once I was happy sketching out the highlighted areas, it was time to turn my attention to all the darker areas. As oil paints are easy to blend together, I like to place a basic sketch down and then reapply highlights and shadows after everything's been mashed together. This process is actually easier than it looks. All that's needed is to gently push the paint into all the little areas you want it. And remembering, this is more of a removal of paint rather than trying to keep it on the figure, as the paint will stick to the brush. Wiping it clean after every little blend will prevent you of leaving the area one colour. As this is the first layer, it is quite difficult to see the highlights and shadows, as they're very subtle. And I couldn't tell at this point, but can you tell what's going wrong? Not noticing what was happening to the skin tone, I forged ahead with the extra highlights and shadows. Normally I'm quite timid when it comes to highlights, so I thought I'd go a little bit more aggressive and apply more paint. The same idea was used on the shadows, as I generally don't darken them enough. And it was at this point I realised why I shouldn't have used phthalo blue instead of the French ultramarine, which I also own. I completely forgot that oil paints lean to certain colours. Phthalo blue actually has a green tint to it, and although the blue lighting that I'm using doesn't show it up, the figure had a greenish tint to her skin, making her look ill or sick. So applying my typical approach to problems, I thought applying a rose blush filter on top would fix the problem. And again, I don't think the camera quite shows how bad it looks. I did try changing the warmth settings on my lighting as well to see how it would look in a more natural lighting environment. Seeing as applying the rose blush didn't work, I figured just apply more rose blush and see if it works the second time. This is what I call chasing the problem. Instead of quitting and starting over, which would have been the right thing to do, my approach of trying to fix the problem only makes the problem worse, and I've done that more times than I care to remember. So it's time for Skin Recipe 2.0, where I swap out the blue for the correct one. And instead of trying to copy the base coat from the original, I create shadows and highlights with a more rosy feel to them. This time, instead of sketching the entire area out first, I spread out the mid-tone colour for the flesh from the shaded areas towards the highlighted areas. I did apply a satin varnish over the model to make sure the previous oil layers didn't mix with my new oil layers. Now came the simple task of reinforcing the shaded areas with more of a purpley tone. Now you may be wondering why the model is starting to look a little bit sunburnt, but I actually have a plan for this after I finished painting. And when I say plan, it's a really risky plan. But before I get to that, it's time to apply all the highlights. Again, these are just applied in the areas I think are going to receive more light and blend it out. Whilst I'm applying her makeup, I'll explain my incredibly risky plan. I've applied a generous coat of satin varnish over the model and will apply colour filters over the varnish and then reapply varnish followed with another filter to create microscopic layers that the light can bounce off, hopefully selling the illusion of layers of skin. So now it's time to lean into the heavily sunburnt skin tone to mimic the presence of blood flowing under the skin. This isn't a trust the process moment, this is a I'm making it up as I go along moment. As you can see, when viewed at different angles, the red blush disappears and reappears depending on the angle you're looking at it. Now to turn down the redness, I'm using raw umber, which is a greenish toned brown. Green tones down red, but I'm not going to use straight out green because I think I know how the model will turn out. I apply this raw umber very sparingly and coat all of the skin and actually wipe away any excess oil paint, only leaving behind what gets stuck in the satin varnish. But when comparing the before and after on a leg, the results can be seen quite clearly. And when viewed at different angles, the reddish tone can be subtly seen. I also used the raw umber to reinforce the darkest shaded areas. As I genuinely believe I was starting to see things, I figured painting a different part of the model would help reset my eyes and prevent me with screwing with the skin tones even more. So I decided to tackle her stand. For this I mixed yellow into green for the highlights and a dioxazine purple for the shadows. This is actually a very dark purple and can almost be used instead of black. As I wanted to layer the greens on top of the shadows, I blended the purple into all of the recessed areas instead of mixing it with the green oil paint first, as the purple is far too strong. When the purple shadows were dry, I could then sketch the greens and the first highlights onto the base. This way the base colour green would actually sit on top of the purple shadow and help tone it down, rather than blending it together, as the purple would dominate the green, making the stand look darker than I actually wanted. To help give the stand a little bit more visual interest, I added a lot more yellow to the green and applied to the very tops of the base. And although I had to wait a day for the purple to dry, this part actually took less than an hour to paint. Now it's time to tackle her clothing. Well, what little of it she has anyway. I picked the original purple and yellow, knowing that I'll mix it with the red to create the highlights and shadows for her clothes. And yes, red and yellow in oil paints makes light red, not white and red. That makes pink. To help make painting her clothes more interesting, use your little wood stick for those hard to reach areas. Ah, the hard life of the humble brush. Obviously you apply the highlights and shadows and blend, just like the rest of the model. It may be difficult to see the highlights and shadows, but looking at her headband, you can see it's darker on the bottom and lighter on the top. Now it's time to tackle the next hardest area of the model, the dreaded eyes. Don't worry about the skin tone. If you screw up the eyes, it will never look good. Now I couldn't quite get it all on camera, but I was aiming for a purple iris. I painted the whites with an off-white colour, the eyelashes with black, and the iris with a purple. And when it came to the black dot in the centre and the white highlights, I used a trimmed pin to apply the paint in small dots. I also used the same purple for her lipstick, then painted her teeth white, followed by red for her tongue. I did them in this order, as any mistakes would be painted over by the next layer. As her tongue did look flat and required a little bit more depth, I added white to the original red to give a pink highlight across the sides of her tongue, helping it stand out that little bit more. Whilst working out what I was going to do with her stockings, I painted all the small metallic areas and her laces. Originally, I actually wanted her stockings and trim on her clothing to be black, but I got so bored of staring at the black the entire painting process, I decided to paint them in ivory instead. Whilst waiting for the ivory to dry, I painted the little gemstones purple as well. Again, I used oils to create the highlights and shadows on all of her stockings and gloves by using a simple white and a grey, and adding a tiny bit of burnt sienna to give the off-white a little bit of warmth to prevent it looking too sterile. To give the hair some colour, I decided to dry brush the red oil paint using a cotton bud all over the raised areas of her hair. It is difficult to tell on camera, but it gives it a reddish brown finish. Once everything was dried, I applied a generous coat of gloss varnish. I wanted to reinforce all these shaded areas and all the contact points of the different materials, as this figure will be mainly seen from a distance, and the stark black lines will actually help my eyes break up all the individual parts of the figure. You must make sure that the gloss varnish is quite thick, or the white spirits used to clean up the enamel paints will actually clean up the oil paints underneath it as well. Halfway through painting this model, I managed to break it in half, and I only realised I chipped the paint on all of the edges after I applied the gloss varnish, so I have to tidy that up. After a matte varnish was applied, you can see all the little dots of the enamel paint that got flicked onto her skin when applying the pin wash. I purposely left these to recreate tiny moles and blemishes. I also chipped the paint on all of her fingernails, so it's time to reapply her purple nail varnish. Although I applied a matte varnish over the entire model, some area of the bodies are actually wet. So I applied a gloss varnish on top of her eyes, inside her mouth, and over her fingernails. As I'm quite clumsy, I did have a small piece of tissue paper rolled up to wipe away the varnish I misplaced. And as hair isn't shiny or matte, I used a satin varnish to cover her hair. I could have called this figure done, but I have this tube of AK Interactive True Metal that I've been itching to try out, and as it uses the same cleaning chemicals I have for my oils, I figured, why not add a little bit of bling to this model. They call it a wax, but it seems to react a little bit more like oil paint, so applying it to her steel toe caps with a brush was quite easy. I also have absolutely no idea how my pen flew off the shelf and landed into the one spot that I applied the silver paint, but in trying to remove the paint I realised buffing it makes it more shiny. So when I was finally happy that I covered the steel toes, I broke up my silicone tip brush and buffed the silver paint until it was nice and shiny. I was also glad to find out that the white spirits do actually remove this silver paint quite easily. I'm still not sure why AK Interactive call this a wax paint, as I'm fairly confident it's actually an oil paint with metallics in, but either way, it's actually pretty good stuff. Even looking at my pen right now, it really does give it a nice metallic finish, so I'll have fun using this in the future. So with all the parts and areas painted to my satisfaction, it's time to marry her to her base. I did practice putting her on her base before I started painting, and although I'm making it look difficult putting her on, I'm actually just trying to be very careful, as I don't want to remove any paint from any parts scraping against each other, even though they are fully varnished. Trust me, it's not fun trying to paint or colour match tiny little chips and scratches. So let me know what you think. I only painted this to see if I could nail skin tones. Do you think I've got it right? Do you think I've screwed it up? To me, it looks perfect, but I am biased because I painted it. Or should I have stuck with the original green tinted skin tone? Anyway, thanks for watching and have fun.